Hello everybody and welcome back to Aurora 4X. I of course am Sir Bedian, and today I decided that we are going to talk a little bit about science. So this is the science screen. Fairly straightforward. Now, I've touched a little bit on it, haven't gone into any detail yet, and I have been using it to pick out technologies to research, but I haven't really discussed about how it all works. Now, it does have similarities to the industry tab, where you have a production rate, you have a cost of item, and then this just chips away at this until this reaches 0, and then you get stuff. But research is a little bit different. So first things first, you have your facilities, you have your research facilities. All right, you build them in industry, of course, and they sit in a pool. Now, unlike industry, where it's all collated into a single unified construction tab where you can use percentages, research is allocated in labs. So each lab will provide this much research points towards a single project controlled by a single project leader. Up here you have a list of all the research underway. Now, this is like industry per planet. So Venus, for example, and all the other ones they have their own lists. So research is planet specific. Very importantly, however, is that research progress is also planet specific. So if I want to stop construction rate research on Australia and switch to Venus and start it here, we'd start from scratch. So make sure that when you're trying to research something, research it all the way through on a single planet. Otherwise, you're just wasting research points. Now, this tab here is fairly straightforward. What you're researching and what field it is, who's researching and what their bonus is, how many labs they have and can control, how many research points they are outputting towards a project per year, which is that times bonus, or 4 times bonus, and there you go, and how much research is left on the project, and finally completion date based on that divided by that. Fairly straightforward. You can also pause projects if you don't want to remove the labs. Now, why you would pause it without removing the labs, I honestly have no idea, because you can just remove the labs and assign them somewhere else if you want to pause a project. But it's something that you can do, so I don't know. Somebody might find use for it. It's also very easy to forget that it's paused and think you're researching when you're not. Anyway, cancel, pause, add labs, remove labs. Buttons are pretty much exactly what they say in the tin. Down here you have a description of the technology that you're researching. Sometimes, reasonably not uncommonly, the description is actually out of date. So keep that in mind. And you have your queue down here. Queue adds the selected research. So you have to select the a person who's actually running a project. Have to select the research you want to do, and then hit queue, and that will queue the project you have selected for the person you have selected. Queue top will do the exact same thing, but it'll put them on the next to research instead of putting them on the bottom of the queue. And remove will remove it from the queue. Once again, fairly straightforward. This here, however, is the meat of the window. So up here you have your fields: biology and genetics, construction production, defensive systems, energy weapons, logistics and ground combat, missiles and kinetic weapons, power and propulsion, and sensors and fire controls. So those are your six. Those are your 6. 2, 4, 6, 8. Those are your 8 fields, and each scientist, of course, corresponds to one particular specialization. Before I talk about the actual projects, I mentioned this before, but Bonus is how much bonus research points a scientist will generate from per lab, and of course it's quadrupled when they're working on their specialization. Max labs is the maximum number of labs that a scientist can control at once. So, for example, if we had 10 labs, Dwayne would still only be able to control 5. Fairly straightforward. Each one of these goes up as the scientist gains skill. So let's talk technologies. Biology and genetics only does 2 things: terraforming and new species, genetic engineering. Now, terraforming is fairly straightforward. You're going to be using it, essentially it's used to add and remove gases to planets. Adding and removing atmosphere shifts base temperature, atmospheric pressure, and stuff like that. So it is useful for reducing a colony cost of a body down to 0, or as close as possible down to 0. And I'll talk about terraforming once we actually have a terraformer. So you research the module, that's a one-off, and then you research how fast it actually works. This is the annual rate per module. So as you can see, it's very, very, very slow. So if you want to teleport, terraform, you want lots of this, multiple of these, and you want to jack this up. The second field of research is genome sequencing. Once you get this, you unlock various factors. Now, the factors you unlock are essentially modifications to these things, to your environmental tolerances. So you can modify your oxygen deviation up or down. You can modify your temperature tolerance up or down. You can modify your gravity tolerances. You can modify max pressure tolerances. You can modify various tolerances up or down. So if we were to get the genome research tech, we would have like temperature up, temperature down, gravity up, gravity down, atmosphere up. I don't think you're going to do atmosphere down. But the point is, you would get multiple bonuses. And then you would research these bonuses, these modifiers, and then when you go into design, you would get new species. So temperature range, base temperature range, oxygen level, and base gravity. So you can modify the base. Okay, so my mistake. You can modify the base, but you can't modify the tolerances. So the tolerances would be adjusted based on the base range that you put in. But you can modify the temperature range. So there you go. And apparently you can only modify a species that hasn't been modified yet. So like you can modify these guys, but then you can't modify these guys. I haven't really done much genetic engineering myself because there's very limited scope where it's actually useful, because the new species can't live in the same colony, right? So you can't just get a couple million genetically modified people to work in the same factories that your regular guys are doing, right? So it can mess with things if you have 2 populations of the same planet. But it does become useful when you have super cold worlds, because super cold worlds cannot be made habitable. And also if there is super low or super high gravity that you really want people on, stuff like that. So there is use for it, but it is niche. So because you only need a little bit of terraforming and genome is extremely niche, biology and genetics scientists are usually considered worthless. Like you have one good guy, that guy's not good. That guy's okay. You have one good biology scientist, and the rest of them basically just sit around and twiddle their thumbs. They're not really that useful. Next category, construction and production. Extraordinarily useful field. This is basically your economic science. So your asteroid mining module, which lets you mine asteroids and comets using ships instead of actual ground-based mines. Expanding a civilian economy increases these numbers, which increases these numbers. So you need less people to fund the same stuff. Also, we actually have production, so we'll come back and talk about that soon. So, but expand civilian economy will increase your wealth income. I believe it also it also increases the trade revenue and income from your shipping lines. So if you increase this technology, you will find that your civilians are a little bit more productive, and there's probably going to be more of them. So if you jack this up, you're going to get some more civilians. So then you have the production rate. So fighter production rate, fuel production rate, mining production rate, research rate, shipbuilding rate, and construction rate. There it is. These, of course, all modify their respective production per building. So fighter production rate will increase your fighter factory production. Fuel production will increase how much fuel a refinery puts out in a specific amount of time. Remember that this will also increase your sodium consumption because you only get a set amount of fuel per sodium. Mining production increases the base mining output per mine. Research rate increases the base output per lab. Shipbuilding rate increases this modifier up here. So increases how fast your shipyards build ships. And that's actually a pretty significant boost, 400 to 560. So that's almost a 50% boost. So we'll probably want to get that soon. Shipyard operations, 5% time and cost saving. That is for these modifications. So things like expanding capacities, which we are actually going to want to start doing here. There we go. But these numbers here will start dropping as you increase that technology. And as this drops, and as this drops with your mod rate remaining the same, this will drop. So your cost and your time will reduce by that same amount. That's why it's time cost savings, and they're not separate technologies. Sorium Harvester is exactly the same as the Asteroid Mining Module, except it extracts sorium from gas giants and instantly converts it into fuel. You do not need cargo bays with a Sorium Harvester to convert it into fuel, so you don't need to actually store the sorium, but at the same time, you also can't harvest that sorium and use it for something else. It's a straight and instant conversion from sorium in the gas giant into the fuel tanks of the ship. So correlate to that you want giant fuel tanks on the ship, not cargo bays. And underground infrastructure. It's 20,000, but it's a one-off, so you only have to spend it once. We already talked about underground infrastructure, so that's fine. Next field, defensive systems. This is stuff that keeps your ship safe. Damage control helps fix stuff when it breaks. Outside the shipyard, damage control can only repair internal components, but it can repair any internal component. It cannot, however, repair armor. So damage control, keep that in mind. If your armor gets absolutely hammered, damage control is not going to be able to fix it. Armor itself, I mentioned tutorial 4, that's on the forums, but essentially each armor technology increases how much armor strength each hull size of armor will actually give you. And I'll talk more about armor once we actually start dealing with actually constructing military ships. And I'll show you how all that actually works in the construction menu. But just keep in mind that the technology essentially shrinks how much armor mass you need for the same level of protection. So more is better. I think that at some tech level you start using more than geranium for your armor. I don't think it's plutonium. I think it's tritanium that you eventually start needing for armor, but I can't remember. I'm not sure. Shield regenerate and shield type. Shield generators and regen rates increase your shields. So a generator will increase the maximum capacity of your shield, and the regeneration rate will increase how fast that shield regenerates. Fairly straightforward, like it says on the box. The last two are cloak and thermal reduction. Thermal reduction will decrease the thermal signature of your engines and therefore your ship, making it harder to spot on thermal sensors, like it says. And cloaking decreases the cross section of your ship. So functionally, it essentially helps prevent active sensors and only really missile fire controls, but it stops active sensors and missile fire controls from being able to see you as far away. And it can get pretty high, down I think 95% is the highest it can get at max tech. So you can reduce the effective tonnage of your ship for detection purposes down to only 5%, which is pretty damn amazing, especially when you factor in ECM on top. Although I don't know if that's additive, multiplicative, or just doesn't care. So that's defenses. Energy weapons are lasers, mesons, microwaves, and plasma carronades. You also get spinal mounts, which only apply for lasers, and turret tracking gear. Oh, and particle beams. So lasers are, well, if you don't know what a laser is, I don't know what you're doing here. You must have stumbled in from some cave somewhere. But lasers are obviously the standard sci-fi weapon. High intensity beam of light, goes pew pew, and punches very deep holes in ships. It has the deepest penetration of any weapon in the game. It penetrates three depth for every one extra width. And once again, I'll explain how that works once we actually talk about armor. Mesons are a rather unique weapon. They only ever deal 1 damage per shot, and they have mediocre to short range, but they completely 100% ignore any and all defenses. So they completely skip armor and shields, and they punch straight into internals. Now, it sounds amazing, but keep in mind, it only ever deals with 1 damage. Large components will very often draw fire from mesons, because they're much more likely to be hit, and large components are also very likely to have lots of hit to kill, which means a meson very often has a relatively low chance to actually destroy anything. So they're not as amazingly, overwhelmingly powerful as they sound if you just pay attention to the fact that they ignore armor and shields. In huge numbers, however, sheer overwhelming odds are going to tear ships apart. And if something has lots of shields and armor, then mesons are your perfect weapon, because even if it takes them 20 hits to destroy a component, it doesn't matter. You don't have to punch through the armor and shields. Microwave focal size is your microwaves. Microwaves are another unique weapon. They deal absolutely no damage whatsoever to a ship except to that electronic DAC. So this here, microwaves roll on this damage chart only. What goes on the electronic DAC? Anything electronics. Sensors, so it blinds you, and fire controls, so you can't shoot. Those are the 2 big ones. So microwaves will essentially incapacitate a ship and stop it from being able to see or shoot back. So very, very, very powerful, but the range is atrocious. So you basically have to run the entire gauntlet of their defense to be able to actually knock out their defenses. Can be useful in niche situations. Very powerful if you can reliably get close to an enemy. Less so if you can't. Plasma carronades are essentially the inverse of a laser, which lasers also have the longest range in the game. Plasma carronades are the inverse of the laser. So instead of having extreme penetration, they have a relatively flat damage profile. I think they might be flatter than missiles, but I'm not sure, because missiles have a 1-to-1. But they have a relatively flat damage penetration profile, and at the same time, they also have an extremely high damage fall-off. But I believe they are significantly cheaper than lasers, and I believe they have a higher maximum damage than lasers. So if you can get right on top of an enemy, then plasma carronades are going to absolutely smash them. But I rarely use them myself because lasers, I like lasers. Now, lasers, now you also have most weapons, so these sizes will increase raw damage. They'll also increase range a little bit, but they'll mainly increase damage. You also have secondary technologies for each one, so the type, so the frequency of the laser, meson focusing technology, microwave focusing technology, particle beams range, and carronades don't have it. But yeah, you also have range ones, so they increase the range. Yeah, you can see torpedo. That's old. That's old. That's wrong. See, torpedoes. Particle beams are not torpedoes. They used to be torpedoes. They're not. They're coming back in C# as torpedoes, as far as I'm aware. Or there might be a completely different technology now. But essentially, particle beams are similar to lasers in that they have relatively long range. However, the difference being that lasers fall off in damage, while particle beams have a lower maximum strength than an equivalent laser. However, they retain their damage at max range. So while a laser will absolutely smash you at point blank range, it'll just tickle at long range. Particle beam will deal consistent damage at all ranges. So that's useful. Reduced size for lasers. So lasers have two additional technologies. They have reduced size, which makes them smaller, but makes them recharge slower. And they have spinal mounts, which gives essentially a multiplier to the raw size of the laser. So it makes it bigger, makes it longer range, makes it hit harder, but also increases how much energy it actually uses, because lasers use energy equivalent to their size. Turret tracking speed is the raw tracking speed that 10% of a turret being gear will give you. So if you set a turret for 2,000 kilometers a second tracking speed with this technology, it will use 10% of its gear. Fairly straightforward. Speaking of turrets, the only weapons you can turret are lasers and mesons. Yes, they're the only... Oh, and Gauss, which is kinetic. But the only energy ones are lasers, mesons, and Gauss. Those are the only three weapons that you can actually turret. All the other ones are hull-mounted only. Spinal mounts are also hull-mounted. So a laser that's spinal cannot be turreted. But the default laser, the meson, and the Gauss are the only weapons that can actually go on a turret. Turrets have extremely powerful properties, but we'll talk about them once we actually start designing them. Next technology, logistics and ground combat. This is where you get better troops and where you get better logistics and get a couple of very useful and important components for ships, especially military ships. Additional maintenance storage is... it doesn't increase your... it doesn't decrease your failure chance for maintenance, but it does give you a huge amount of maintenance supplies. So very useful there. Boat bays and eventually... Where are they? Are they here? No, I think I have to do boat bays first. But boat bays are essentially docks. So they're tiny little hangars. So boat bays are small hangars, and then you also have actual hangar bays. The tonnage of the dock is pooled in the ship, so you don't have to worry about having to fit a 250-ton fighter, especially because 125 is garbage to build. Cargo handling system, it allows a ship to load and unload faster. I mentioned that in the design window here. And you can see the math here. You can read it for yourself. Colonization cost reduction gives a flat reduction of colony cost for a stellar body. Now, it says planets or moons, mainly because asteroids are usually too small to be colonizable and the gravity is usually too low. But I believe it should still modify their colony cost if you can get them colonizable. Combat drop modules allows it allows a troop transport to instantly unload any ground units that are loaded into combat drop modules. So instead of having to land and then wait for them to unload, they just drop from orbit. Very useful. Construction brigades is a ground unit. One construction brigade, they're a little bit expensive, but one construction brigade counts as a factory. So it counts as a factory, but very, very, very importantly, it doesn't require any workers. It does require, I believe, a little bit more wealth to produce, and then you have the mineral cost to produce them. But a construction brigade is a tiny factory that you can move using troop transport bays. 5 of them specifically. They're actually 5 large, but for example, if you need construction capacity on a planet that has no people on it and you don't want to put people on it, you can put a construction brigade on there and it'll count as a factory. And it gets the full bonuses of a factory as well. Cryo transport allows you to transport people, actual colonists. Also allows you to store survivors and prisoners of war that you pick up from escape pods. So that's that. Engineering spaces reduce failure chance and add a little bit of maintenance supply. There's a little bit of complicated math for exactly how maintenance supply capacity works, and I'll talk about that once we actually start designing ships that need it. Flag bridge. If you remember, I talked about the flag bridge in the leaders and task forces episode. The flag bridge allows you a ship to house the task force. Fuel storage, different sizes of fuel storage. Garrison battalion, it's a very defensive ground unit with no real offense. No dying today. Ground unit strength increases the base strength of any ground unit. So that's straightforward. Improved command and control as a construction of sector commands. Sector commands are these things. So they allow you to actually make sectors. There's a very important step that most people will forget about sectors. Once I actually get one, I'll show you what that is. Maintenance modules are essentially a component in a ship that works exactly as a maintenance facility. So each maintenance module is one maintenance facility worth. Exactly the same, except that they do not require workers. Mobile Infantry Battalion is your standard ground unit, and you get more of them as you get better ground units and then you eventually get Marines, which get bonuses for ship for boarding combat and stuff like that. And I'll talk about all that much later, but yeah. Orbital Habitat Module. This is an extremely useful component. It's when in orbit, it can house 50,000 workers at, I believe, 3 colony cost. But that's nothing special. Where it's super duper powerful is that any commercial ship, sorry, it doesn't work for military ships. Second you put a gun on it, you lose this bonus. And you screw yourself because the orbital hab module is 250,000 tons. So your maintenance goes out the floor. But any non-military ship that has an orbital hab module no longer requires a shipyard to be built. Instead, it gets built through here. Not here. Here. So it appears here, and you can build it using this rate instead of this rate. So orbital hab modules let you build absolutely colossal stations that you normally would not be able to build. So things like putting 100 asteroid miners on a ship and sending it off. That kind of crazy stuff. Replacement battalion are ground units that can essentially be converted into essentially reinforcements. Salvage modules allows you to salvage actual wrecks and turn them into a portion of the mineral cost of the original ship, and also extract any surviving components. I'll talk about how a component survives the destruction of the ship once we talk about a little more in depth about damage and combat. But once you get a wreck, you want to be using the salvage module to salvage it so that you can get technology for components that are better than yours, so you can get the components themselves, which you can then either dismantle, disassemble, scrap, or use. So salvage module is one of those things where it has a lot of uses that you are going to be using. So you definitely want to get this at least at some point, preferably early on. But you don't actually need it until you actually start blowing shit up. So right now, we're going to ignore it. Ship-to-ship tractor beam allows one ship to attach to another. If you've seen basically any sci-fi series in the last, as long as there's been sci-fi, tractor beams should tell you exactly what they do. Troop transport bays allow you to transport ground troops. Fairly straightforward. Now, this is not the entirety of what we can research. Some things get, like I said, some things get unlocked as we research more stuff, and some things are just the base of a tree, but that's logistics and ground combat. Missiles and kinetics. Railgun, all the various missile techs, and Gauss. So, railguns are essentially pulse lasers. For all intents and purposes, they function like pulse lasers. So they fire 4 projectiles at once per shot, and the total damage is 1/3 higher than a similar tech laser. But that damage is distributed across those 4 shots. So a railgun is more total damage, but you get significantly less penetration to armor. It also has a bit less range. But it is also smaller than a laser, almost significantly so. So railguns are significantly better to be run on fighters and smaller ships that can get fast, they can get in close, and they don't have very much, they can't really afford too much overhead. But railguns are fantastic against shields. It mentions susceptible to armor, yes, but they're fantastic against shields, because shields are a single pull, so that 1/3 extra damage essentially means that they deal more damage overall against shields than lasers do. So railguns are more effective against shields, less effective against armor, potentially, whereas lasers absolutely smash the living daylights out of anything with armor. Railguns, of course, cannot be turreted, because they're not on the list. Gauss cannon is your, eventually, depending on how you design, Gauss cannon is either going to be the point defense gun, or eventually is going to become the point defense gun. If you can do fast fighters, railguns are more effective because they fire 4 shots straight out and they're absolutely tiny, whereas early Gauss are very large to remain at full accuracy. They're large, so you can't easily squeeze them into a fighter without hurting that accuracy, and initially the first rate of fire is only 2 shots, whereas a railgun starts off with 4. But Gauss can get up to like 8 or 9 shots per 5 seconds, so it will eventually supersede the railgun for the amount of shots it can do. Now, why are the shots it can do important? Because shooting down incoming missiles, you want to have lots and lots of shots so that one gun can shoot down entire waves of missiles. So Gauss rate of fire is a very, very powerful technology, and every single tech level makes your Gauss that much more powerful. Launch velocity, however, beyond the first two technologies for gas launch velocity are basically all you will ever really need, because final fire for point defense is done at 10,000 kilometers. So if your gas has a range of 10,000 kilometers, then you can do final fire. If your gas has a range of 20,000 kilometers, then you can also point blank fire against any ships nearby. So 20,000 kilometers is all you need on your Gauss gun. Your fire control you want higher, but the Gauss itself only needs 10, 20 at most. Because the max range of the Gauss gun is the shortest in the game, maybe on par or longer or shorter than a microwave, but it's microwave and Gauss are the shortest range guns in the entire game. Plasma carronades have a shorter effective range, maybe, I think. Yeah, they have a shorter effective range, but they still can actually hit further than the Gauss and the microwave. Of course, if you can sit on top of something with multiple Gauss guns firing half a dozen shots per 5 seconds, that's a lot of damage, even if they're one-shot hits. There's railgun launch velocity. The rest of it is pretty much entirely dedicated to missiles, except for the ordnance production technology, which is here instead of construction. The rest of it is entirely missiles. So you have missile warhead strength, so you get more power for the same tonnage of warhead. You get magazine technologies, so ejection systems causes a magazine to effectively defuse itself, so that it doesn't blow up. Feed system efficiency, it increases how much space is devoted to actual ordnance. So essentially, same size, with better technology, the same size magazine will fit more missiles. Missile agility per ton, and that's about it for the actual missiles. But you also have the launcher reload rate, so this lets your launchers reload faster, and it's launcher size reduction, which makes your launchers smaller but increases the reload. Exactly the same as the laser, but a little bit more granular. Whereas laser only has like 2 or 3 steps. Reduced size launcher has multiple. At the end of the reduced size launcher is a hotly debated, arguably broken technology of box launchers, which I will talk about once we get missiles. But they're functionally internal pylons compared to actual, like a torpedo tube, like you would have in a sub, where you can reload the tube. These are one-shot, box launchers are one-shot tubes. But yeah, I'll talk about them once we actually talk about designing missiles. I think that about covers missiles and kinetics. Power and propulsion. You have... Why do we have a 25 AP nuclear thermal engine technology? Oh, yeah, no, I was using that as a dummy technology. Okay, forgot about that. Okay, power and propulsion. Of course, you have your reactor and corresponding engine tech, which we have nobody working on just yet, but we're going to be shifting labs eventually. So power, of course, allows you to build power plants to power your non-missile, non-Gauss weapons. And engines give you more power per ton for an engine. Capacitor recharge rate is for your energy weapons, how much they draw. So energy weapons, I'll talk about how they work once we actually design energy weapons. Fuel consumption is a flat multiplier reduction to fuel use for engines. This tech is amazing. It literally costs you only research points. It costs functionally a little bit of wealth and time, but once you have it researched, it's a one-off cost that will benefit you forever. Because increasing this technology has zero cost on the engine itself. Jump point theory, which we'll talk about, which I'll go into a little more detail about what falls out of this once we actually design jump drives, and then maximum and minimum engine power modifiers. So maximum power, of course, gives you more power for more fuel, and minimum gives you more fuel efficiency for less power. And of course, the reactive power boost, which is exactly the same as the max engine power, except for power plants, but it also makes it more likely to blow up and explode if it gets shot or fails. Engines can also explode based on their power mod, but we'll talk about that later. Finally, the final field, and it looks like this is all we're actually going to be talking about in this episode, just science. The final field is sensors and fire control. First up, active grav sensor strength. Now, there are 3 forms of sensors and 3 forms of... Actually... Yeah, 3 forms of emissions, okay? First form of emission is first form of detection is the active gravity sensor. The way this sensor basically works is it sends out a active pulse. It's essentially like active sonar. It sends out an active pulse. That pulse bounces back off massive objects in the solar system, and then that pulse bounces back and is picked up by the EM sensors mounted to the actual grav sensor. Okay, the EM sensors on a grav sensor do not act as passive EM sensors. They only listen to the active grav pulse. So just because you have an active sensor does not mean you're going to get bonuses of the passive EM. You need the separate sensor for that. But the active grav sensor works against the target cross section, which is this, of your target, which is functionally your total hull size, which is essentially your tonnage. So the stronger the grav sensor, the longer range, the stronger the pulse, the further out you can detect stuff for the same tonnage. The better your EM sensitivity, the further out you can detect stuff for the same tonnage. Fairly straightforward. They essentially give you the same bonuses towards your active grav sensor. The second form of detection is thermal. That is given off by engines. The stronger that is detected by thermal sensors, passive thermal sensors. Passive thermal sensors will essentially run their sensitivity versus the thermal signature of a ship. Ships are detected individually, so a fleet with lots of small ships does not have a stronger thermal signature than just one of those ships. So you want a better thermal sensor to be able to detect things from further away. And the third one is electromagnetic emissions. Electromagnetic emissions are given out by active grav sensors, and they are given out by shields. So shields running, active shields will give out an EM signature, as will running an active grav sensor. If you turn the grav sensor off, then it's obviously not going to get picked up, the same as shields. But once you turn them on, then a passive EM sensor will be able to detect those emissions. A passive EM sensor is also much better at detecting colonies. As you can see, our thermal signature is only 9200. Our EM signature is 36,000. So you're going to be able to pick up that EM signature way further out than you will the thermal. All ships have a strength 1 passive EM and thermal sensitivity, which you can see here. So that's your passive EM, passive thermal, gravity survey points, geological survey points. So active sensors are not listed here. They are completely separate. This is your passive detection. Geological and gravitational survey sensors are in here as well. You can get better ones there. Beam fire control range. This is your racial technology for beam fire control range, and the beam fire control can multiply it. Beam fire control controls everything that's not a missile. Every gun that is not a missile or a Q's system needs a beam fire control. The Q system, close-in weapon system, also gets better as your beam fire control range gets better, but not in the same way. But yeah, any weapon that is not a missile needs a beam fire control to fire. Missile fire controls are a combination of active and passive EM sensors. They use the exact same technologies as your active sensors, so they don't appear separately. But if you want to improve your missile guided fire controls, you want to improve the same things as your active sensors. Electronic hardening is a technology that allows your electronic systems to survive against microwave weapons. Now, non-player races do not use microwaves. I'm sorry to say, but non-player races do not use microwaves, so if you are playing purely against the AI, you will never need this technology, because they just don't use it. Electronic warfare unlocks ECM and ECCM. ECM stands for electronic countermeasures, ECCM stands for electronic countermeasures. Each level of ECM decreases the range of a missile fire control and gives you a flat penalty to accuracy of a beam fire control by 10%. Each level of electronic countermeasures cancels one level of electronic countermeasures. So a ship with ECM 20 will provide a 20% reduction to fire controls trying to shoot at it, while if you link an ECCM of 20 to that weapon system, you will negate that countermeasure. So you want ECM, you want ECCM. So these are very, very useful technologies to have. Now, it's rumored that regular NPRs do not use EWAR, but spoilers, 2 of them at least, definitely do. I have still yet to confirm whether NPRs, myself at least, whether they actually use EWAR or not. I really hope they do. Because EWAR is interesting. EM sensitivity, already talked about. Fire control speed rating, same as beam fire control range, but for speed, you can multiply it by adding size to your fire control, but that's the base racial speed, so obviously the higher the better. Beam fire control, even if you're not using offensive beam weapons, you want this for your defensive beam weapons. This one more so than this one, actually, because to shoot down missiles, you really need the tracking speed more so than range. Geological sensors, we don't have the gravitational sensors because we don't have jump drive tech yet. Once we get the jump point theory, we'll get the geosurvey sensors. This is the other training tech that I did. Max tracking. I'll come back to this one. Planetary sensor strength is the Deep Space Tracking Station strength. It is thermal only, I believe. So, and they are additive together. So, it's essentially a giant colossal strength X times the actual number thermal sensor. So, these things can see even small ships from across half a star system away if you have like a dozen of them. So they are extraordinarily powerful if you need to be able to know exactly what's in your system without having picket ships everywhere. But if you only have a few of them, they can be of limited use. And thermal is for passive. Okay, let's talk about max tracking time bonus versus missiles. Here is what it should do. Okay. The longer you have a missile tracked, actually, rewind. Accuracy for a beam fire control is speed of target, is tracking speed divided by speed of target as a percentage. Okay, so if your tracking speed is half of the target speed, you have a 50% base chance to hit. Specifically, you have a 50% penalty to the base chance to hit. So your final fire control accuracy is decreased by 50%. And then I believe ECM is added in as an additional 10. I've been meaning to test it. I don't know for sure. But I believe that it's a flat 10% on top of the final hit chance for ECM, which just absolutely smashes any low accuracy. But once we test it, we can see how it goes. But the way it's supposed to work is the longer you track, for every increment you track, you have a missile on active sensors, it negates 1 or 2% of that penalty that your tracking speed has. So, for example, tracking speed bonus was 20%. So if you had sufficient tracking, if you have the missiles on active sensors for long enough to get the full 20% bonus, you would take the 50% penalty to your tracking speed minus 20% bonus, leaving you only a 30% tracking speed. And your tracking speed, max tracking time bonus versus missiles can get up to about 80%. So even though missiles can get significantly faster than fire controls, you still get a reasonable chance to hit, which means late game and even early game, your point defenses remain effective against missiles, right? So you just add more sensor range onto your active sensors, pick up the missiles further, get that bonus, and then your point defenses remain effective against missiles that are faster than your tracking speed. Because tracking speed only goes up so quickly, it doesn't go up fast enough to keep up with how fast missiles can get faster, right? Here's the problem. Everything in the game says tracking speed bonus works. If you go and turn on, where is it? Not in here. In here? Yeah. If you turn this on, it will tell you that you're racking up the tracking speed bonus. It'll tell you. The problem is, it doesn't work. The bonus that you should be getting, that you are getting, doesn't work. It has exactly zero effect on your final accuracy. So this technology in 7.1 is 100% a waste of your research points because it literally does not work. Never get it. It's supposed to be getting fixed in C#. Wait for then. And use multi-layered defenses and fast tracking speeds to try and compensate for it. Or just more point defense guns to try and compensate it, because that's the only way. What does that mean? Well, what does that mean for point defense? It means that once missiles get really, really fast, point defenses start to fail. You need more and more tonnage of point defenses to keep up with missiles, which only get better as technology advances, until eventually your point defenses will not be able to effectively keep up to missiles. You will eventually have to switch to using AMMs to be, which are anti-missile missiles, to be able to effectively keep up with incoming anti-ship missiles or ASMs, getting faster and faster and faster. So this technology, 100% worthless. Don't get it ever. Wait until it's C#. Then we can talk about getting it once we know that it actually works. But for the moment, it doesn't work. Don't bother with it. And that is technology. Now, ideally, because you have a limited amount of research points and a limited amount of actual research capacity, you want to pick like 1 or 2 weapons and focus on those. Ideally, you want missiles are the most versatile, and you can get a lot of stuff out of missiles. Oh, you'll notice that there's no engines. That's because the missiles use regular engine technology. So if you want to make missiles better, you want to get better propulsion tech. Yeah. So ideally, you want missile technologies. But whether you get missile technologies or not, you should also be getting either energy weapons or kinetic weapons, right? You ideally want to seriously consider getting Gauss guns, because that extreme rate of fire at late tech is basically the only thing that makes makes point defenses worthwhile, because like I said, you need more shots because your tracking speed can't keep up with the missiles, so you need those shots to essentially brute force through sheer numbers, being able to shoot down missiles. So Gauss rate of fire you want. You ideally want to get your Gauss technology up so you can maintain effective point defense coverage. But you ideally also want at least one actual offensive weapon. That means railguns, particle beams, lasers, mesons, or carronades. Any one of those, pick one, maybe two, use those, focus on them, because the big problem with missiles, they run out of ammo. And like V says at the end of V for Vendetta, what you don't have guns. What you have are bullets, and I hope that when your guns are empty, I'm no longer standing. No, unfortunately, you can't use them as clubs. By the way, no, you cannot ram things. The NPRs can, the spoilers can. You can't. You can't ram things, so no, you can't use them as clubs.
That's shit.
Yes. Unfortunate. But yeah, you ideally want at least one offensive energy weapon or direct fire weapon, because if you run out of ammo on your missiles and you can't run away, you're going to die. Plain and simple. You either have to be faster than anything else, in which case, why are you not using guns? Or you need to have something that can actually wade in and keep hammering while it's standing, and be at the absolute minimum a distraction for the enemy fleet, while your missile ships make a brisk and quick, or plodding, or however you built them, escape off stage. So, missiles, if you want to use them, and whether you do or not, you want at minimum couple of levels of Gauss, so you get that good point defense, and you want a minimum of at least one of the offensive direct fire weapons. That about covers technology. I think I've talked way too long for it, because I think so far this is the longest episode I've done for the new series. So I'm going to stop talking now, because there's nothing else that I can fit to go into any kind of actual detail. Next episode, we are hopefully going to actually continue on finishing the survey of Sol, and I think, can we actually do freighters? I don't think we actually can, because we don't have the cargo handling. I don't know. We'll figure something out. But yeah, next episode we're gonna keep building up. We have research labs next. We're currently 20th of May 9. Next production is going to be the mass drivers, 2nd of March 10, roughly. So we've got a little bit less than a year before we start building labs. They're going to take ages, just because of how much it takes to actually build them. But not too far off. We do have more construction factories coming out, and the commercial shipyard is going to be finished a little bit before the construction factories are, about 2 years after the mass driver. And hopefully we'll have the construction rate finished in November 2009, which is only a couple of months away. About 6 months away. So construction rate's going to help with that as well. But that is the end of this episode, so I'm not going to keep rattling on. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one, when we continue expanding our industry. Yeah, see you then.